for a book called How to Rig an Election, which was all about the different strategies that presidents and ruling parties use to manipulate elections around the world. So perhaps I have a little bit of an insight into what might be happening in Uganda right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just new on the stream is my co-host Patricia. Patricia, nice to see you. Nice hat.
Thank you very much. People power our
I can tell you that Lina was already on here, but we lost her connection. So when she's able to reconnect, then we'll hear from her again. Actually, I think she is there again. Hi, Lina.
I am so sorry for this unstable network. I am so sorry. Yes, as stated, my name is Lina Zedriga Waru. I am the Vice President of the National Unity Platform, and my area of jurisdiction is Northern Uganda. We are in the middle of a very abnormal presidential and parliamentary campaigns in Uganda. I'm excited to be here present today with you, and thank you for your continued vote of confidence. Thank you.
Yes, and thank you so much for all the effort that you're putting into the struggle.
Thank you.
Yeah. And meanwhile, I am checking some things. Maybe you can take over here, Patricia.
Nick Chisholm was speaking, so he can go on ahead and finish up.
Sure. I mean, I thought what it might be interesting to do to talk about today is a little bit to put Museveni's strategies into, a broader context, so perhaps both historically and across Africa. I've been sort of working on Ugandan elections for, I guess, about 8 years, but reading up on Ugandan elections over a much longer period of time. And, I think it's fairly clear that there are a number of different strategies that Museveni uses in different combinations, right, over time. He uses the strategy that he's using now, which is violence and repression and arresting leaders. He did this to Besigye before Bobby Wine. Often a similar strategy to what we're seeing now. It's often a number of arrests over time, with the opposition leader not necessarily being arrested for that long, but being arrested consistently to disrupt the campaign, to prevent the opposition leader from having really big rallies, to make it look like they don't have real momentum. But often in Museveni's case,
my network is over.
All right, we'll give him a moment, and then if it doesn't come in, Lina Zedriga, you can go on ahead. Perfect. Maybe we can go with you, Lina. I had a question for you. Are you able to give us a summary of this week's events?
I beg your pardon. You were breaking. I think the network overall is so bad. Yes, please.
Are you able to give us a summary of this week's events in Uganda? There's a lot of dead bodies on the street. Yes. Go on.
Yes. The presidential campaigns for NorthernUganda went on very well last week, and until Sunday, where I handed over the whole process to my colleague in Eastern Uganda, was Nyambeche, on amidst all the tear gas, rubber bullets, to do so that I can prepare on two things. One, training our polling agent for the presidential campaign, which is due early next year. So as I was feeling good, the 18th, I rudely informed about the militaristic process in which our president that brutality. But on my own experience, very briefly, while still in the Uganda, and we had a successful first in Oyam, and we are now hosting with the advanced team to go to church. I at Loro Junction, more trading by and stick men. We were bundled on the back of a pickup by these people.
Oh, unfortunately, we have now also lost Lina. So I'm back with my Malawi connection, Nick, because you also got kicked out a couple of minutes ago.
NRM.
Yes. So were you able to understand a bit of what Lina was saying? Because the sound quality was not very good. Yeah. And Lina is back again.
Yes. So my own arrest, men, military, police, bundled and put in a jail with men. In my wildest dream, I would never ever have thought about that. To another person live with me, and overnight, and then the whole conversation I could hear the policeman trumping up charges. At my arrest, I asked the question, what are my crimes? And I was told I should keep quiet. I'm being arrested to keep my life. That is scary. That is scary. And they said,
all right. She's speaking about her arrest sometime last week. She was
any more question or even talk. And anyway, I was taken court on late, and thank God I went straight to then handed to my. So on Wednesday, because what Roti was an indication, we were heading in for other level of military arrest because we were entrusted by a military man. We had to end up running foot to the campaign venue. Tear gas and bullets, and it has gone. It was arrested. As we speak, there's a lot of tear. Currently, I'm not in Uganda, I'm in Kampala. He's passed to his, which is about 5 meters from here. The lot of tear gas going on. So, in terms of democracy, I think right now we have left that issue of democracy, militarized, brutalized process, which is not anywhere near democracy. It's not. But one thing is, what the fact that the community resilient for are in rivers to just and half of that venue, those are glimpses of the president. So after our sporadic riot out to Uganda, many people have been arrested. They're all over in hospitals and clinics. We are all by it, but we are also.
Okay, we've lost Lina there, but yeah, the sound connection is unfortunately also bad. So now we've also lost Nick. This is quite a program with many technical problems. So what I think I will do, because everybody has seen what has happened this week, Patricia, and the capturing of Bobi Wine has caused many demonstrations and outcries in the rest of the world. and we were sent a movie by some people in Amsterdam, and I'm going to try to play that. It gives a bit of insight in what is going on.
Nick is actually here. Nick is here. So before we lose him, please, Nick, please continue. So before we lose you again.
Well, I was going to say, I think one of the things that's really interesting right now is that, Museveni's used this strategy over time of arresting people, of disrupting campaigns. And of course, this isn't just a pre-election strategy. So after the last election, we also saw raids on Besigye's party headquarters and so on to disrupt the attempt of Besigye to demonstrate that the election had been manipulated. We'll see exactly the same thing this time around. There'll be constant raids on party headquarters, attempt to disrupt the party, attempts to disrupt data collection. I think what's really interesting this time around is we're seeing bigger protests, right? The arrest of Bobi Wine has generated greater unrest in Uganda than the arrest of Besigye last time round did. And I think there's a really interesting question here from Museveni, which is actually, is this going to become a self-defeating strategy? This has worked well in the past, but actually is Bobi Wine's support, especially amongst younger people in urban areas, so great that actually this strategy actually it's more support for him, generates unrest, generates international criticism around the world. Is Museveni actually going to have to look for another strategy because this isn't actually working? And I think that would be a really interesting question because, we've seen three sort of strategies over time. The one is the use of violence and repression and the arrests. The other is the use of the state apparatus. And, often we talk about the NRM maybe not having a lot of kind of content as a real political party, but of course it can rely on the state and its control of the state to do things. And of course, it's got a fairly ambitious state apparatus, and particularly in rural areas, it can try and dominate politics and to stop people accessing information. And then on the other hand, we know that Museveni, although he publicly talks about the fact that he doesn't like bribery, is not averse to handing over bags of cash to different groups in different parts of the country as a way of establishing those very personalized patron-client relationships. And I wonder whether one of the things we're going to see, if this sort of repression turns out not to be as effective as it's been in the past, is he going to have to use those other strategies more? Are we going to see more censorship? Are we going to see more money being handed out? Is he going to be forced into those strategies because this one's not actually working? Because it seems to me right now that the sort of way that Museveni has rigged elections in the past is becoming less effective, or at least is generating greater costs to him in terms of the eyes of the world and the number of people who are dead and the unrest that's generating for Uganda. And of course, Museveni has sold himself historically to Ugandans as the person who provides stability, who resolved the conflict, who doesn't lead to a return to war. Vote for Museveni is a vote for stability. Right now, that entire mantra doesn't seem to make any sense, right? A vote for Museveni is actually a vote for political chaos around elections. Yeah. So one of the things that I'm is it just the same record again and again, and he's going, or are we actually going to start to see Museveni putting something else forward? And I think that's, to me, that's a really open question. Museveni hasn't faced this level of popular unrest before, and I think it'll be really interesting to see how he responds.
Yeah, because obviously 2 weeks ago we had elections in Tanzania, and the strategy of the president there was a total knock on opposition. Yeah? So Museveni might try the same strategy. Do you think the Tanzanian situation is comparable to the Ugandan situation?
I think it could be. I mean, both Tanzania and Uganda are, coming from a point where opposition candidates have, let's say, won 40% of the vote. And in Tanzania, what we saw was President Magufuli basically decided that that was not acceptable. It was not acceptable to have opposition parties winning 40% of the vote in parliament, and it was not acceptable to have an opposition presidential candidate who was going to win 40 to 50% of the vote nationally. And so Magufuli basically went out to decide that systematically he was going to take control. And we saw that before the elections. So we saw CCM trying to prevent opposition candidates from actually nominating themselves and filing their nomination papers in certain parts of the country. Throughout the election, we then saw high levels of censorship. And then, of course, around the election, we seem to have seen a lot of, basically ballot box manipulation. And then when the opposition started to protest,
so I think there we lost
leaders being arrested. All that we'll see. It's not. would be a significant step up, being about, not just arresting Bobi Wine, but arresting all of the leadership underneath Bobi Wine, 100 or so other political activists, and also then manipulating the elections, not just presidentially, but also at the national legislature level and all the way down the system. And that would be a significant shift in Uganda from what we've seen before. What worries me is that the lack of international condemnation of what President Magufuli did in Tanzania may embolden President Museveni. Museveni may be looking at Tanzania and saying, if Magufuli can get away with it, why can't I? And actually, let's get rid of this opposition for good. Let's not just defeat the presidential candidate, but let's reduce them to such a level that they have no seats in parliament, that they're effectively no scrutiny. I can change the constitution at will, but also I reduce the opposition in terms of its ability, for example, to make money and funds from its control of seats in parliament or certain parts of the state. And all of a sudden, opposition is almost eradicated. And I do think there's a real concern about that, because if you were looking at what happened in Tanzania, you wouldn't be thinking that Magufuli paid a very high price for that strategy. You wouldn't be thinking that the international
Go on, Nick.
And I think the other thing that I think is really interesting to me, and I pose this question to you guys as a question, not a statement, is I'm really interested in how far Bobi Wine is able to develop a really powerful support base that extends into rural areas. We know that Bobi Wine dominates urban areas. We know that he's going to win Kampala, phenomenally. We know that he dominates social media. When we did a Resistance Bureau podcast and we had Bobi Wine on, the response was significantly different to any leader we've ever had in terms of its support, its fervency, etc. So we know all of that. But we also know historically that Museveni has won elections by losing urban areas and winning rural ones. And we know that in Uganda, more citizens vote in rural areas than urban ones. So it always seemed to me, both with Kizza Besigye before and now with Bobi, that the real challenge is not urban areas, which you're going to dominate. It's rural areas and actually persuading people in rural areas that you can win. And I remember that there was a survey back in, I think, 2016, when I was doing research in Uganda around the elections. I was in Fort Portal at that time. And the survey showed that a majority of Ugandans did not believe that you could change the government via the ballot box. In other words, a majority of Ugandans believed that almost whatever you did around elections, Museveni would come out being a winner. And I've always thought that one of the big challenges in Uganda is actually persuading Ugandans, especially those in rural areas, that Museveni can be beaten. Because if you could do that, you could persuade everybody to turn out and vote the way they really wanted to, you could defeat Museveni. But if everybody believes that ultimately Museveni will fix the vote and will win whatever, then what's the, why risk your life by going out and voting for Bobi Wine? Why be in a rural area and wear a Bobi Wine t-shirt? Why take that risk? So I guess the question I'm really interested in, maybe Lena and Patricia and others sort of speaking to, is, how able right now with the harassments, the arrests, the detention, is Bobi Wine, able to get into those rural areas and really extend his party base and build that national support that you really need to, to challenge Museveni?
Perfect. I think this is a good question for Lena Zedriga, but I, for one, I can say that from the very beginning, People Power, Bobi Wine was doing consultations, wanted to do consultations. We tried hard to get to the rural areas, to get to the people and ask them what it is that they wanted for the manifesto to be, the new Uganda. What did they want? However, Museveni did a very good job frustrating that process. And so we pushed social media, we reached out to people by calling them through phone banking. But even right now, as we speak, as we saw with Bobi Wine's arrest, with Lena Zedriga's arrest, that was really a result of Museveni realizing that, yes, Bobi Wine does have support in these rural areas. That's something that they basically kept saying, that our support was basically centered around the capital, Kampala, Masaka, however, that narrative has now been crushed, and that's why they are arresting Bobi Wine time and time again, and that is why they have resorted to violence, nationwide violence in Uganda. And of course, Nico also can really answer this question because he has done a survey on elections in Uganda, and he has more insight on how the vote is going to turn out and who it's going to favor in the next election.
Yeah, that's actually interesting because Nick and we already had a discussion about that. But before coming to the survey, Nick, this is your book, right? Yeah. And I have some questions.
Yeah.
You think Museveni has a copy of your book?
I don't think Museveni needs it. I think Museveni could have written it.
Yeah, exactly. And you also provide a couple of examples of the things that were done in Uganda, but also in Zambia. Now, I don't know if you or Brian Klaas wrote that part, but I saw this interesting anecdote that you gave about the elections like 10 years ago, and the opposition party did have the votes, but they didn't have the money against the government. And the government, just like the Ugandan government, was just giving out money in turn for their votes. And then the opposition came up with the phrase "Don't kubeba," which means just give me the money, but don't tell them that you're actually going to vote with your heart and not with your wallet.
That's mine.
Right?
Yeah, I was at that election. So that was the then running mates for Michael Sarter, Guy Scott, who had English and Bemba, but not enough Bemba, I think, to complete the full statement. So he merged English and Bemba, don't kubeba, an English word and a Bemba word. And yeah, meaning, you can take their money, but don't tell them that you're going to vote for us anyway. And I think we've seen this in a number of countries, right, where opposition leaders have said, look, you can take money from wherever you want. You can take food from wherever you want. You can take, other inducements from wherever you want. But we do have a secret ballot, and you can go into the polling booth and you can vote for whoever you want, and they can't tell. So, take all the money that the ruling party is giving you, but vote for us. And in Zambia, that proved to be very effective. And we've seen a number of countries.
Nick, we don't hear you. Yeah. But while we don't hear Nick, one of the things that Nick is also describing in his book, various techniques where you
vote buying is actually ultimately proved to be fairly ineffective. And
all right, Nico, go ahead.
Yeah. Let's just give it a couple of seconds.
Yes.
So we're in a total blackout here. Everything has gone. The lights have gone. The electricity has gone. It's not just a bad line. So what I was saying was that we've seen that in a number of elections, and I think it's partly because people often, and actually it's much more sophisticated. And voters often don't simply want to sell their vote. They want to vote for somebody that they believe is credible.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah. What's interesting in your book, Nick, is that you're saying ballot box stuffing is basically the last resort of a president. It's not the best strategy. And in the survey that we are going to be discussing later, it shows that actually Museveni is lagging Chigalanji a lot at this moment. So the question is, at some stage you come to a point, how many ballots do you have to stuff into that ballot box to win? And at some stage there are not just enough ballots available anymore. Did you hear that, Nick?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things that is often true is that leaders win when they basically lose, they rig, when they lose by a relatively small margin. If you lose by a really big margin, it can actually be very difficult to rig the election. And in Zambia, Michael Sata basically beat Rupaya Banda by so many votes that there were not enough votes in the country. There were not enough ballot papers in the country to fill in to get the president over the line. I think in Nigeria, probably in 2015, it was a bit the same. I mean, Goodluck Jonathan lost by so many votes that, actually there probably were not enough ballot papers in the country to be able to get him over the line. So I think those things, do make a difference. And I always say to my friends in opposition parties across the continent, if you really want to win, you probably need to win by 5%. If you win by 1% or 2%, it's too easy to manipulate the vote to get the president over the line. It's when you win by over 5% that you can probably win, because that's so big that it becomes really difficult for the president to actually manipulate the votes to make it look like they were successful, unless the president is going to completely give up on credibility and legitimacy. And of course, that's what we saw in Tanzania, right? What was really striking, and I think for many of us really worrying in Tanzania, was that the government gave up on credibility and legitimacy. They basically said, we're not even going to try and make it look democratic. We're not even going to do the things we used to do to make it look legitimate. We're actually just going to arrest everybody and make the results up. And that's a really scary moment, because that's the moment when actually the government almost, moves to a point where anything becomes conceivable. And, it'd be really interesting to see. We could be, as you said earlier, in that moment in Uganda where President Museveni completely gives up and simply fabricates everything and moves to arrest the entirety of the Bobi Wine infrastructure. It could be where we go. As soon as you move in that direction, of course, then all bets are off. Because the president no longer cares about making it look respectable. But to go back to some of the examples in the book from Uganda, I mean, we talk about the last election, 2016. There's a number of areas in 2016 where President Museveni wins 100% of the vote on 100% turnout. Now we know that that's not possible, right? It's not possible that every single person was available to vote. Somebody would have died. Somebody would have been sick. It's also not possible that every single person actually, even if they wanted to vote for Museveni, someone would have made an error. It's not possible that every single person voted for him. So we know that there are lots of areas. Now, this isn't officially an electoral offence. It's an electoral offence to have 101% turnout, and 101% of people vote for President Museveni. So, officially, he's within the rules. But it's not plausible, right? It's not logically plausible that he could win 100% of the vote and 100% turnout in so many parts of the country in his home areas. So again, I think there's this really interesting question that, all the way through when Museveni's rigging elections, he's trying to rig it in a way that's officially legal. There's nothing illegal about getting 100% of the vote and 100% turnout. It's just implausible. It's not possible. We know that it's not true. So will he have to go even beyond that to win this election? And again, then you lose the legitimacy. Everybody can see. It's like the emperor's new clothes. Everybody knows that this was a clearly rigged and manipulated election. But to go back to what we were saying earlier, maybe we're now in a moment in Africa where leaders feel that they can be that brazen, that they can actually be that blatant. Yes. Because, whatever we think about Biden, even if you think that Joe Biden will be a better leader of America and will engage more constructively with Africa, he's not going to be president of America for another 60 days. And the UK is completely consumed with Brexit and the coronavirus crisis. Most of Europe and the United Nations is not actually operating effectively to promote democracy around the world right now. So maybe this is a particular international kind of constellation of factors that is, leading to a lack of promotion of democracy that actually, will embolden somebody like Museveni to do that. And I think that's one of the big risks, I think, and fears for me moving forwards.
Mm-hmm. In your book, you also discuss gerrymandering a lot. Now, maybe some of our viewers don't know what that word means. So gerrymandering is where you adjust the voting districts in such a way that you just get over the majority so that you have the seat. Now, for a presidential election, the form of the district doesn't matter that much, but it seems because Museveni has also added many districts and changed many districts, but it looks like it's not so much done to have the majority of the votes there, but to be able to obscure the process, enable to rig elections. Do you also see it in that way?
Yes, I do, but I'd also add a second thing. I mean, in many countries in Africa, we see presidents creating new units or districts ahead of elections. And it's often because these are basically seen as ways of buying people off. They create opportunities and jobs. They're often ways of giving people, different parts of the country a bit more recognition. So they're often, in a sense, a kind of patronage offer or a clientelistic offer to try and bring different parts of the country into the system. I remember, so I think President Kibaki in Kenya managed to create something like 200 additional districts before one election. And as much as it was about, sort of trying to obscure things, it was about basically trying to make promises to those parts of the country that, look, if you vote for us, we'll create these new districts which will be responsible for you, and you'll potentially get greater access to state resources. So I think it's also a kind of a sort of vote buying type strategy as well. Again, I think a big question is, how much do people buy it? Do they say, well, we've had these promises before, every election, President Museveni comes around and tells us that the economy will do better, there'll be more jobs, he'll create these new units, and actually after the election, a lot of this stuff doesn't materialize, so we no longer believe it? Or, is there a way in which he can persuade people that this is true and that this means that he's a good person to vote for? And of course, he's been relatively clever in that he's identified that he needs to try and appeal to the youth. He's identified that he needs to kind of make new and additional promises. I think the question I have is whether, Ugandans, having seen Museveni in power for quite so long, really believe any of those promises anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Maybe this is a good point to ask our colleague Maria if there are any questions from the audience, because Nick, we're also broadcasting on El Kyoto, and there are many comments coming in. And Maria, can you tell us, are there any questions for Nick?
There is no any question specifically for Nick, but most of the questions that comes in actually the hashtags. But one question goes, how do we go beyond discussions on this platform? That is James William Mogeni. So he's asking, how do we go beyond just having discussions on platforms and have something tangible?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
Go, Nico, what were you going to say?
No, I want to give you the word.
No, I think it's a really great question, and we actually discussed this recently on our show, The Resistance Bureau. That if you look at Zimbabwe, for example, Zimbabwe Lives Matter as a hashtag trended around the world, had international traction. It was trending in the US, it was trending in the UK, it trended in South Africa. It was seen to be successful. There were lots of discussions online, and yet Mnangagwa is still in power, ZANU-PF is still in power, and some of the people who we were at the time protesting about being free, like the journalist were then arrested and denied bail. So, what good did our international sort of movement, what good did our Twitter, what good did our social media presence actually do if actually on the ground the president's still in power and journalists that are revealing corruption is still...
I think he will come.
Yes.
Maybe Maria, you can. There were other interesting comments.
Go on. No,
So I think I got cut off there, but I was just saying that, so I think the key is, does this social media presence and discussion get connected to something real in the country concerned? And I think that means at a certain point you have to ask questions like, are trade unions or urban workers on the side of a certain candidate going to be willing to strike? Can you bring the country to an economic standstill in order to protest the lack of democracy? Can you actually bring religious groups and organizations, which often sit on the fence because they don't want to offend the government? Can you bring them into the conversation and actually have letters from pastors and church leaders saying this is not acceptable, the abuse of human rights is not acceptable? And if you can start to build from the online conversation to civil society groups, religious groups, trade union groups, urban mobilization, Bobby Wine support base, all of a sudden you can start to create a coalition that cuts across urban rural areas, potentially even cuts across party lines of people who are saying they want to see democracy and they want to see a free and fair election. And that's when, for example, in places like Malawi, you really start to feel that the government is being forced back. The government is almost forced to allow a better quality election because of the strength of that coalition against it. But it's extremely difficult to do. I mean, I was on a call yesterday with Fatma Karume talking about Tanzania, and I made a similar point, and she said, you know, it's all well and good for you sitting in Malawi saying this as an academic, but the people on the ground who are the civil society activists are going to have to risk their lives to go on those protests. They're going to have to risk their jobs to, you know, go on strike. They're going to have to risk angering the president to write those statements, and religious leaders might risk their churches being shut down or targeted if they actually come out and say something that's critical of the ruling party. And I think that's true. I mean, one of the terrifying things that we've seen in recent days in Uganda and also in Tanzania is that arbitrary use of force. You know, we see people who are actually being shot dead. In Uganda, I don't know if you can confirm this, Nico and Patricia, but you know, I was also receiving reports not just of violence, but also of people who are outside of military uniform or police uniform using guns, shooting at protesters, shooting above the heads of protesters. So moving to a point where actually it's not just official uniform personnel, but it's actually people who are out of uniform who are doing this. And that kind of suggests, you know, a fundamental breakdown of the rule of law as well. So I think, you know, it's one thing to say this is how you would translate digital action into real world action and therefore put the pressure back on the president. But it's a very different thing to actually realize that given the risks that people would have to face.
Yeah, I think I can confirm that indeed there were people shooting on the street with just civilian clothes, and clearly they were accepted to be there by the military. So yes, we are unfortunately making that step.
And I think that's a really worrying step, right? That's a really dangerous, worrying step. It's a step towards something that we've seen in other countries when you then get people in plain clothes conducting things like abductions. And in places like Zimbabwe, when people are actually go missing and the police then deny knowledge of them going missing, partly because it seems that they've been taken by perhaps people in plain clothes as a way of denying that the state actually was involved in this. And so I think that move from officials to people in uniform to people outside of uniform is really important. And some people have said to me over the last few days, why does this matter? You know, as long as people are shooting at protesters, it's all the same thing. But I think actually as soon as you start to see people out of uniform, that's suggesting to you that this is a deliberate attempt by the state to harm
and Patricia, I think this is probably a good point to discuss our survey that we've done. Shall we do that, Patricia? You're muted, Patricia. So I'll just go ahead. So just a second to open it up for our viewers. So Nick, last month I already shared some results with you, and they were also published on our website. And so last month we for the first time performed a survey through WhatsApp, which I think is a new technique, but it's a technique that was interesting, but it also worked very well, because it seemed that Ugandans were actually quite willing to answer questions about politics. Now they were a bit hesitant to say which candidate they favored. That they were fearful for that. And last month we found that Chigalanyi had already a big majority of 61%, and Museveni was having 34%. But this was before nomination day and before all the violence that took place. And what we have seen we've been asking the same question to our respondents this month, so the same ones that responded to our last month, and we actually see a shift. Mm-hmm. So the support for Museveni in our survey group dropped from 34% to 28%. Now, not all of them went to Chigalanyi. Chigalanyi increased by 2%, but also the other opposition candidates, Muntu, Amuriat, but also to my surprise, Kabuleta, they have significant sizes in our survey. Now, one of the interesting things that you already mentioned was rural versus urban areas. Now, and because we are querying through WhatsApp, not everybody in rural areas has WhatsApp, so that is clear. But still, a quarter of our respondents were from rural areas, and surprisingly, we found the same support for Chigalanyi among rural voters as under urban voters. But one distinction where we find a very strong distinction, and that is what I want to show you, is per region of the country. We really see big differences between the west, the north, the central, and the eastern parts of the country. So in the west, where Museveni is originally from, he still has 58% support of the people. In the north, it's about equal, but in both the east and in the central provinces, Chigalanyi has about 3/4 of the votes. And then age. I think age is also an important driver. Basically, what we see is that Chigalanyi appeals much more to the young audience, and especially to people that vote for the first time. We see that people that voted Besigye in 2016 typically vote Bobi Wine now, and the new voters also go to Chigalanyi with approximately 65 to 70% of the votes. Now, Patricia, you're supposed to be asking me the questions. So
after your amazing introduction, I'm curious to find out, you live in the Netherlands. Why was it important for you to do the survey?
Yeah. So what surprised me was that we're having elections, but there are no polls available. Mm-hmm. And when I searched a bit, I found one by RWI that was published in August, but it contained results that were done in March, mm-hmm. and they had also included Besigye who is not running, obviously. Yes. So it was pre-COVID with Besigye. So it was basically of no use at all for the Ugandan situation.
Perfect. And can you tell us a little bit more about how you did it? I know you talked a little bit about WhatsApp, but can you give us some more details on how you were able to conduct this survey?
Yeah, so one of the important things is when you're doing a survey, you have to prevent any biases. If I go to do a group among my own friends, WhatsApp groups, then I will find a large majority for Chigalanyi. So the challenge is really to have an unbiased sample group. Mm-hmm. And so what we did is we wrote a computer program that generates random phone numbers. Mm-hmm. And there's a limited number of mobile phone suppliers in Uganda, and basically most of the phone numbers have been taken. So if you just try a random number, then it's likely that someone picks up the phone. Now, not everyone has WhatsApp, but when we constructed 6,000 random phone numbers, we found that approximately 700-800 of these people had WhatsApp. And if you do the full math, that would correspond to about 3 million WhatsApp accounts in Uganda. Now, obviously, there are far more voters, 16 million, but still 3 million with respect to 50 million is not that bad. And so then we just started to write to these 600 WhatsApp accounts, and not all of them responded, but a great deal did respond, and actually was not only giving detail about their vote, but they actually wanted to share much more. They shared videos with me. Nice. Then they called me because they wanted to see me, not just because they were fearful. They wanted to be sure that I was not a secret agent, but also because they just wanted to tell their story.
Yes.
And so it was. I really got to know much more about Ugandans doing this research. And then one thing that was very striking, and I'll show you this conversation to give us a bit of an idea how it went. So in October, there was one person that had told me that he was undecided, and I asked him again, who are you going to vote for now? And he tells me, big change, because he told me he was arrested. He had been walking by the street, and according to him, the only reason he was arrested was because he was wearing a red hat.
Yes.
And he was thrown in jail, he was beaten, he was stolen of his possessions, and released the next day. Yeah, and then he tells me he's voting for a national unity platform, which is no surprise, obviously, if you are being arrested. So then it really comes close to someone who is abroad like me.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And clearly, you've already shared the screen with us. But thank you very much for that input. What are your thoughts, Nick Chisman, on the survey that Nico conducted?
Well, Nico and I have discussed this before, and I have a number of questions about, the size of the sample, and as he said, how many rural Ugandans we're missing. And I think, as I said before, I'm sure that Bobi Wine will dominate the urban vote. The question for me is the rural vote. The one thing that Nico said there that I found really interesting was that he thinks there's perhaps an increase in support for Bobi Wine over recently, looking at kind of the people and shifting opinions. And I think that's really interesting. I talked a little bit before when we talked about the violence, about the fact that, there's a real question here about whether this is going to backfire for Museveni. And there's some evidence. There's a nice piece by a colleague of mine, Anna Rouse, and Christophe Teteka in African Arguments, which looks at different strategies Museveni is used to rig elections. And they talk about the fact that some of the past attempts to use violence, for example, the attempts to use trumped up rape charges to detain Kizza Besigye, were actually backfired, actually generated more support for Besigye because people saw that this was an illegitimate attempt to prevent the opposition from having a say. And so I wonder, Nico, whether your sort of recent survey findings suggest a similar thing here, that actually the poor treatment of Bobi Wine by the government might actually be increasing support for him rather than decreasing support. And that returns us, I think, to what I was saying earlier about, is Museveni actually using a self-defeating strategy right now? Is the constant arrest of the opposition going to actually backfire? And your survey seems to suggest that perhaps it might. So that would create more of an imperative for Museveni to try and find a new strategy. But as you say, it's very difficult because in a lot of elections, we would have multiple opinion polls. Even in recent elections in countries like Kenya, we'd have 4 or 5 opinion polls. In Uganda, we don't have, the kind of national opinion polls that we would have. So it's very hard to tell. And of course, I think that's a deliberate strategy of the ruling party. They don't want to have national opinion polls because they don't want any evidence that Bobi Wine has support. And so, keeping those, keeping a lid on that kind of evidence, those kind of polls is significant. I think one of the things I really worry about is, what will the NRM try and do when we get to a point, for example, where Bobby Wine might be holding a rally in an urban area where millions of people might be hoping to show up, and is the government going to simply prevent that on the basis that they're very nervous about they're very nervous about that showing that he has support, and that support is building a real basis for him amongst the population. And I wonder whether they'll try and step in again and shut those things down. Now, of course, they have done that in the past with Besigye, but it looks to me right now like Bobby Wine has a slightly more sort of intense, fervent form of support than Besigye did. And actually trying to shut those rallies down might cause a lot more instability than shutting Besigye's rallies down did. So, I do think we need to be very clear that Uganda is in a really dangerous political moment. And the strategies being used by the government are likely to lead to a considerable loss of life over the next few weeks as we move closer to the elections. And I think, again, I'm disappointed that we haven't seen more criticism of the government strategies by the international community, because I think we can all see which way this is heading. And strong international statements probably won't stop Museveni, but they might at the very least give him, pause for thought about the consequences of some of these actions. And to not see that, I think, is really quite worrying.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So first, to come back to your self-defeating strategy, yeah, I agree with that. That's why I pulled up my screen again, because the question I asked this month, so this was before Bobby Wine's arrest, but there was already been quite a bit of violence on the campaign in the north and the east. And so I asked if there's too much police violence, and over 90% of the people, so that means even a majority of Museveni voters, were of the opinion that there was too much police violence. So yes, that would indicate the self-defeating strategy. And furthermore, also over 50% of the people were of the opinion that that violence does affect the votes. And yeah, so although Museveni controls the media, so he is able to still get out this story. Yeah, these are just hooligans. It's just unrest. You need me for stability. But he has more and more problems of keeping up that charade. Yes.
And I think the big question then, which we've already touched on, is the question of, do people just at a certain point feel too scared to actually vote? What we actually, one of the things we saw in Tanzania is a very low turnout, really low turnout. And do we see a low turnout in parts of Uganda where people don't want to vote for Museveni, but they're too scared to go and vote for Bobby Wine? Or, do all of those people turn out? And I think a big factor in that is going back to that point about, do people really believe Museveni can be defeated? Because one thing that you get when you get increasingly violent elections is you get more of an incentive for people to simply stay at home. And I think Museveni has done this in the past, right? The use of the crime preventers at the last election, all of these kind of little attempts to intimidate people, to use kind of militias or different kinds of security forces to generate the idea that people are being watched. All of this is about making people too afraid. And I think one of the really big, interesting things for me moving forwards is, has he succeeded in intimidating people into that extent, or is this a new kind of more confident opposition under Bobby Wine, because of Bobby Wine's personality and because of the energy of Bobby Wine and because of the things we've seen over the last year? Is this actually a different situation, and Museveni doesn't really understand it? I think that that's really for me the big question moving forwards.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you look at the Kizza Besigye campaign, some of those people have shifted onto, stayed in the movement, and they've shifted, towards people power, and they're fighting alongside NUP. But in that campaign, those were different players, in a sense, to a certain extent, doing things differently. And they faced their own wars with Museveni. And then now, with this new space that we're in, these are young people mainly. These are new players. And so what Museveni has done right now in terms of killing people power supporters, killing civilians, it's new to all of us. We anticipated this, but at the same time, you still can see people out there on the streets protesting, regardless of the fact that they clearly know that their lives are in danger. You know, so as things progress, yes, Ugandans are going to get out on the streets and protest bad leadership. Ugandans will get out and vote. I don't know, not so many people internationally covered the youth elections, but during the youth elections, a lot of young people got killed. You know, the NRM was at polling stations paying these young people and older people not to vote, and they still stood there. They refused the money and they voted. You know, so I strongly believe that Bobi Wine definitely has the support of the people of Uganda. And right now, as people see this increasing violence that's now affecting not just NUP supporters, it's not just affecting, you know, People Power supporters, Kizza Besigye supporters, it's affecting all of us. And this is the message that Bobi Wine and People Power has been preaching. We've been saying that no matter who you are, no matter what you support, by the end of this movement, you would have been affected by dictatorship in Uganda. And so we've been calling out for all Ugandans to support the movement for change, regardless of ethnicity, political affiliation, or religious background. And this has been a great example of what we have been talking about. And as Nico said with his survey, because of the new survey that he's just done, because of this election violence, it is very clear that even the people that supported Museveni are now shifting over to supporting other opposition candidates like Kabuleta, Amriat, who's a POA from FDC, and of course, Bobi Wine, who clearly continues to have the largest amount of support. And just to tell you a little story, on one of these campaigns, and again, in these rural areas that you keep asking about, which is a very good question, one of the roads was blocked, whereby Bobi Wine could not, the supporters could not pass to access Bobi Wine. And that's what they did. They swam through the swamps in order to ensure that they get to go and listen to Bobi Wine speak. And so, yes, the people in rural areas are interested in voting in the next election. And nothing is going to vote to stop Ugandans from, you know, attaining the change that they seek and moving forward into a new Uganda that we all desire to live in.
Yeah, thanks, Patricia. Yeah, you saw me just on the phone. I was talking to Louis because obviously we had invited him to be on the show. Obviously, what we didn't know that today would be the day that Bobi Wine would be released again. They just came back from Kampala. Obviously, had a very, very tough day. So he's going to try to join for a couple of minutes later on. Now, maybe one thing that we can do now, all of our guests have disconnected. It was very interesting to see all the reactions worldwide, although it were not governments, like Nick was saying, but there were many people on the streets demonstrating. And a friend of ours from the Netherlands, Timo de Driesen, has made a very nice movie about a demonstration that took place in The Hague. But I see someone new on the call. Hello.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm well. How are you doing? Am I audible?
Yes, you are. We can definitely hear you. And we know you're busy, so maybe we'll just go ahead and move on to you. We just want to give Louis to introduce yourself and also give us a summary of this week's event in Uganda.
I'm really trying to get the sound of. Hello?
Can hear you, Louis.
Oh, you can hear me?
Yes.
All right. Can you kindly repeat what you just said?
Please briefly introduce yourself and give us a summary of this week's events in Uganda.
Okay, so I'm David Louis Rubongoya, and I'm the Secretary General of the National Unity Platform, a party which is led by the Honorable Chagulanyi Sentamu Robert, also known as Bobby Wine. As you all know, this week has been a very difficult one in Uganda, and in many ways, in this part of the world, in the region, because we've seen the military use excessive force against the citizens in the country. As you know, Bobby Wine was arrested on Wednesday and, kept in a prison called Narfenya, which is famously known for torture and such other actions. And, he was held without access to his lawyers, his doctors, his family members. We were only able to see him today when he was brought to court, finally. But right after his arrest, we saw protests break out in the country, and in the different parts of the country, people are saying, they wanted Bobby Wine to get his freedom. And what we saw was the regime used excessive force, including people who were not uniformed on the streets holding guns. And in the process, statistics indicate that over 37 people have lost their lives in this chaos. Government puts the figures at about 29 people, but we know that many more people have actually died in the different parts of the country. Over 500 have been detained. Over 100 battling with wounds in different hospitals. Yeah, so that's what I can say the situation has been. Of course, Bobby Wine has, as a presidential candidate, has not been able to continue with his campaigns as he should be, because the government gave us very few days within which to campaign, only 60 days. The country has 146 districts. Previously, the law provided, and quite logically, that during the campaign period, at least a presidential candidate should have an opportunity to reach one district per day. But right now, the government gave only 60 days. We know it's because of the popular support which Bobby Wine has. So the government has been trying to limit him and restrict him. At some point, it was supposed to do consultation, which the government limited. So all this that we see is a continuing trend of repression, of persecution, and an attack on democracy.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Louis. And can you please let us know how's Bobby Wine doing right now?
What's that?
How is Bobby Wine doing right now after he was
okay. Bobby Wine is okay. He's strong. He's certainly firm. He's very saddened by the passing of so many Ugandans, innocent people, in what someone might call a bloodbath, because there are many people who must be dead in different parts of the country from the accounts we are getting. But otherwise, he's strong. He's healthy. He was brutalized when he was arrested, pepper sprayed, and he was still complaining of the pain in the eyes and all that. But otherwise, he's okay.
Perfect. And then, are there any terms for his bail?
Yeah, so he has been released on bail. It's non-cash bail, thankfully, but he had to, undertake certain conditions. And one of the things that the magistrate talked about was, that Bobby Wine needs to observe SOPs. Those SOPs put in place to prevent the spread of coronavirus disease. And of course, we have been very categorical from the start that if these rules are to be enforced, they must be enforced uniformly across the board. What we see is that coronavirus is being instrumentalized. It's being used. It's being weaponized. It's being used to crack down on the opposition. If you look at Museveni, everywhere he goes, people hold rallies, people hold processions on the roads. His supporters are free to gather as if there's no coronavirus. But every time people gather around Bobby Wine, they're tear gassed, they're brutalized, some are murdered. So we think that what we're seeing is coronavirus being used as a pretext to clamp down on rights and freedoms in this country.
Perfect. And before I ask you more questions, Nick Chesman. You had a question for NUP about the support. Do we have support in rural areas? Can you please go on ahead and engage with Louis on this topic? Nick, are you there?
So on the, yes, sorry, I just cut out there for a second. The line is still not fantastic. Well, I think one thing that I'd be really interested to know about is whether or not you feel that this is a similar set of strategies to the ones that Museveni used in the last election, or whether you feel that this is a step change and something significantly different. It feels, I think, to those of us from outside who are watching this, that this is a different level of violence and unrest to 2016. But I'd be particularly interested in your thoughts on the ground about whether or not this feels like something new. We talked a little bit before about the fact that people, you know, shooting guns who are not in any kind of uniform is a particularly worrying development, because it's often something the government uses as a way of trying to avoid responsibility for human rights violations. So again, I'd be really interested in your perception about, you know, why are we seeing people who are not in uniform with guns on the street? What does that mean? Is that something new in Uganda, or is that something that we've seen in the past?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think we are faced with a very different situation because of the different dynamics. We have argued in the past that President Museveni can get worse than any dictator that has ruled the face of the earth, except that he normally responds depending on the pressure that he gets. Right now, he is extremely unpopular. The young people are saying enough is enough. He's been in power for 4 years, coming to 35. So in 2016, for example, he did not face as much resistance, as much, yes, people were opposed to him, and he lost an election and rigged it. We are very, very convinced about that. But we know for sure that right now the dynamics, the odds are so much against him. And so that's why we see increasing levels of violence. And today the Minister for Security was actually asked why people are, you know, moving on the streets with, without uniforms and with guns. And he said, you know what, we respond to situations as they come. He basically justified it. He said, you know, if you're in this kind of game, you also have to behave like this, like the people. So what he's basically saying is, first of all, admitting that these are people who are working for the state, and what it means for our country is it's a very, very sad thing, because we do not know where it will end. It's a very, very bad sign, and I think it's leaving a very, very bad taste in the minds and mouths of many, many Ugandans who have only been seeing these pictures from places like Somalia, from Benghazi, from other places. But now you see people boldly carrying guns on the streets of Kampala and shooting people indiscriminately. So that's what I can say about that. I think Museveni's strategy from way back, from when he took power, has been violence. And like I said, he unleashes level of violence based on what he's faced with. And what we see now is that because people are more emboldened, people are more courageous, people, you know, are saying enough is enough, then you see him, you know, get to even higher levels of violence against the citizens.
Nick, maybe I can ask you if you have any recommendations for NUP in these elections to avoid the rigging.
Yes.
I mean, it's very difficult because, of course, one of the is to have your own part of the country, and that's an extremely big challenge for a party agent in every single polling station is a big challenge. Ruling parties often try and disrupt that process. So we talked a little bit in the past about, you know, the way that the ruling party prevent the Besigye team from being able to demonstrate might have been manipulated. We are likely to see the same thing again. In Kenya, before the 2017 election, some of the foreign consultants who were in the country trying to help the opposition collect exactly this data were actually arrested and forced to leave the country by the government. So, you know, you've got an opposition party that's trying to collect data to demonstrate that the election is being manipulated. And the best way to do that, right, this election at a later stage, demonstrate that the results from the polling station suggest a different outcome. But it's extremely difficult to do, because getting that level of comprehensiveness and then being able to avoid the government disrupting your activities is extremely difficult. But that is, you know, the gold standard. And in Ghana in 2016, the opposition party did a great job. They were able to have 2 party representatives in almost every single polling station. Those representatives took pictures of the results at the polling station level. They sent those into a central location, and then that central location counted all of those results, and they were able to basically tell people what the election result was before the ruling party or the electoral commission actually announced the results themselves. So that's a brilliant system if you can do it, but it's extremely difficult to do. It's also very expensive, you know, because you need to at least pay something small to most people to get them to stay for 1 or 2 days during the whole process of counting and voting. And of course, to keep them there, you also need to be able to provide them with food and drink so that they don't have to leave the count. Because of course, if they leave the count to go home to get dinner, they're no longer safeguarding the ballot boxes and the vote. So it's an extremely difficult thing, and it's things that often helps with that is if you have really effective domestic observers and of course foreign international observers. But I suspect that, as in Tanzania, we won't see effective international observation, and of course you will all know that even in the past. So it is a really tough thing to do. And I think it's, you know, it's one of the real reasons why whenever I talk to opposition party leaders, I say to them, you know, don't, because it's your systems and your structures that will protect the vote on the day of the election. The rallies will excite people. They'll make people think that you are an exciting, charismatic leader. But it's the systems and the structures that will mobilize the vote and actually protect the vote. But as I say, it's an extremely, extremely difficult thing to do. And of course, in a lot of countries, you will have the media will play a role like that. So in the United States, the media has played a role like that. They've collected the results from different areas. They've projected who's going to win. They're saying the opposition candidate is going to win. Of course, in a country like Uganda, where the ruling party dominates the media is not going to perform that role. So a lot of the natural checks and balances against electoral manipulation aren't there. Of course, you would then be looking for an independent electoral commission. But I remember, you know, famously reading an interview with the electoral commissioner during a previous election where he said officially that he felt that Kizza Besigye was not presidential material. So when you have the electoral commission itself coming out and making clearly partisan statements, then of course you have very little grounds to believe that they're going to do a fully independent job. So I think it is a really difficult, challenging thing to do in a context like this. And of course, one of the things that we're also seeing is we're seeing President Museveni very adeptly to extend his control. You know, COVID is something that is a reason to shut down Bobi Wine and opposition mobilization, but isn't something that's used as to shut down ruling party opposite mobilization. And so you have a double standard where COVID-19 is used as a stick to beat the opposition, but not as something that's done for the ruling party. And again, I suspect that we might see those same double standards playing out when it comes to the actual counting of the votes itself. So, for example, I would expect that groups that try and protest the results and of irregularities in the results will be told that they're not allowed to protest because of coronavirus regulations and that they will be fired upon by police because it's a threat to national health. Whereas, of course, celebration parties for President Museveni will not, face the same situation. So I think one of the things that we don't talk about enough is that it's actually really difficult to expose electoral manipulation and to show it. Not in the sense that we don't know it's happened. We often know that it's happened and we have a really good sense that it's happened, but showing it scientifically and forensically in a way that will stand up in a court of law is a really difficult thing to do, especially because opposition parties often have really short period of time, often only 7 or 14 days to prepare that case. And that means it's extremely difficult to be able to demonstrate that. And of course, that allows judges who are often selected by the ruling party to find problems with the data or the evidence that's been selected and to throw it out, which is something, of course, that's happened in Uganda, but also in Zambia in recent years. So it is a really difficult thing to actually prove that an election has been rigged and actually have that stand up in the courts. Of course, Kenya 2017, Malawi 2019, we did see 2 cases where the courts actually ruled that a presidential election was illegal. So it's not impossible. But the judiciary in those 2 countries was significantly more independent than it is in Uganda right now.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I have to excuse David Lewis. He had to leave for something urgent. So it was not an implied thing of him to do, not to wait for your recommendation to finish, Nick. But I do have another question for you. We have discussed the reaction of the European Union, and we have also discussed why the European Union is not sending any observers. So first they told me that they weren't invited, that was their reason for not coming. But if I understand correctly, yesterday they actually said they really didn't have an intention to come because of basically the failure to improve elections. Can you comment a little bit on that?
Well, I wrote a piece in 2016-17 that was quite critical of international observers in Uganda. It was after an observation group held a press conference in which Ugandan journalists asked them very pointed questions about whether the election was free and fair. This was in a context where Kizza Besigye had been arrested a couple of times, and the Ugandan journalists were saying, how could an election be free and fair when somebody's been arrested? Is it free and fair? What's your verdict? And the observation group kind of said, well, read the report and come to your own conclusions. And my sense was, if you can't answer a question like that honestly and straight, then perhaps international election observation isn't actually doing any good. And I think, I have a lot of sympathy for observers, because if you condemn every single election, you don't necessarily have the opportunity to help make small improvements over time. But the question that I've asked observers in countries like Uganda is, are you making small improvements? Can you say to us, look, that, we know that we're not calling out every single electoral abuse, but that's because we're involved in a long-term process of supporting elections, and we're seeing incremental changes, and over time we're seeing democratization and better quality elections. And if you can say that, maybe you can just you really need to be able to say, maybe we don't go, maybe we simply say we are not prepared to legitimize this election by turning up, sitting there, and if their verdict is that the elections can legitimate in the elections, and so they've decided not to come, I think that's an improvement. I think more international observers need to be able to say, you know what, we've made recommendations for 4 elections in a row, you haven't acted on them for 4 elections in a row. This has become a game in which you're.
Now we really lost him.
All right.
And Maria, when Nick comes back, you then have a question maybe for him from the audience. Let me add Nick again. Welcome back, Nick. Please continue. You can continue, Nick.
So I was just saying in relation to your question about observers, essentially that if they've decided not to come because they don't think they're having a positive influence, and I think that's a good decision. And I think international observers can get stuck in the situation where they legitimate elections by turning up and then not completely condemn that the election isn't going to be good quality, that their recommendations are not being implemented, and they've decided not to come. I think that's a good thing. I think it's basically a way of calling out the election and saying that actually we're not having a positive effect, and so we're not prepared to go through the farce. And I think in some ways that's a good thing, because what they're basically saying is, we're done with this. We're done with being kind of complicit in this system. Of course, the risk then is that there's nobody on the ground to collect data and to really demonstrate to the international community what's happened. And I think one of the risks is that embassies and international donors then say, well, we can't be really strong in our condemnation of the election because we don't have international election observers on the ground collecting the data. So the big risk is that people then say, well, we don't have our own guys collecting the evidence, so we're not willing to be as critical. So I guess what I would say would be a good situation is if the international observers don't come, but make it very clear that they're not coming because they don't think that they're. And if international donors and others actually continue to make strong statements based on the clear evidence that is coming out of Uganda right now about the situation. I think it would be a shame if they don't come, and as a result, the international community is actually much more silent about human rights abuses. That would be a shame. But I do think that in other countries, maybe we could see the same thing. If observation is not making any improvements time after time after time, cease the observation. Because otherwise, what's the punishment for the government for failing to implement the recommendations of election observers? And I think it would be quite interesting to see over the next few years if that was started to be done systematically. If once elections aren't improving, observers refuse to come, whether or not that starts to be something that really embarrasses governments and forces governments to actually try and make the elections more, a better quality. The concern, of course, that I think we all have is what we talked about earlier, that, following the elections in Tanzania, there seems to be a sort of rising trend of governments not really caring about making the elections look legitimate or credible. And of course, that means that, Museveni might not really care that election observers are not there, because he might not care about the kind of credibility that they generate. Tanzania didn't really suffer much from not having election observers. And so it may be that, the risk, of course, is that other elections say, well, why do we need election observers ourselves? After the elections in Malawi, when there were no international election observers and they went well, President Mnangagwa in Zimbabwe said that election observers shouldn't be present at the next Zimbabwe election because, hey, Malawi didn't have them and look what happened in Malawi. And of course, that then sets off alarm bells for all of the organizations in Zimbabwe, because of course, you really do want international election observers in Zimbabwe because there are so many different aspects of the process there that are also manipulated in the same way that they are in Uganda. But, broadly speaking, I would be in favor of them taking that stand.
Yes, absolutely. It would be nice to really see the EU come out publicly. They have talked about it a bit with the UN as to why they are not going to be monitoring the elections this year. But we need a much more assertive push by the EU, something more international. That's why they will not be covering these elections. And something that they said was that in 2016, they covered the elections. They saw that there were so many things wrong with the way the elections were run. And they made suggestions. They made about 6 suggestions, and none of them were actually followed up with by the Ugandan Electoral Commission or the Ugandan government or authorities. And so in this election that is coming up, they basically are saying, what are we going to do here if none of these improvements were made, But let's go on ahead and continue with Maria. Maria, do we have any questions from the audience?
Yeah, I think most of the questions that follow up with actually the presenter just mentioned about the international community, responding, and then it was questioned several times that if the international community knows very well and they've observed elections and they know well that elections have been rigged, why do they continue to fund the government?
And of course, there's many reasons to fund governments. Historically, we've seen some donors willing to fund governments because they put development over democracy. And so they funded governments they believe delivered on development. And of course, Museveni historically has done very well with that. He presented Uganda as a kind of guinea pig for international donors that would do what international donors wanted, whether it came to HIV/AIDS policy or development policy. And international donors, particularly, for example, in the UK, bought into that and funded the government as a way of kind of trying to show that their policies could work if they were implemented properly, and perhaps then had a big incentive to not be as critical as Museveni's lack of democracy, because they were getting traction when it came to development policy. Of course, it's also true that Museveni has been really smart. He's put troops into things like AMISOM in Somalia, and he's made his forces central to foreign policy for America around Africa, especially in anti-terror operations. And that's made it quite difficult for the United States to be overly critical of Museveni, because they're worried that he will keeping operation good problems. So, you know, we've got foreign policy goals, we've got development goals and so on, all of which play a role. But I think there's another point that we need to make here, which is that at the minute, I think there's a crisis of leadership. I don't see anybody on the international stage that is galvanizing support for the protection of democracy. You know, we've seen during the coronavirus, you know, a process of democratic backsliding in multiple countries, not just in Africa, in Asia, Latin America. We've seen that around the world. And instead of seeing strong and effective leadership from Europe and North America to defend and protect democracy, we've seen governments looking insular, you know, looking at their own problems, being obsessed with their own coronavirus issues, their own government issues in America with the mess that is the US election and so on. And I think one of the things that's happened is we've lost international leadership on democracy. Perhaps we've lost international confidence in the ability of the international community to promote democracy abroad. And one of the things that's important to keep in mind is that this isn't just a phenomenon of Trump. This actually goes back before Trump, falling budgets for democracy promotion activities and so on. And of course, at the same time, we've got the rise of China and a number of new partners in Africa who are much less keen to promote democracy abroad because they don't have democracy at home. And it's not just China, it's also countries such as Russia, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, and so on. And I think when you put all of that together, you start to realize that this is actually quite a complicated and difficult international context in which we lack leadership. There are multiple different goals. There are multiple different countries engaging, and we don't have, strong international focus and coordination. It's also true that when it comes to a country like Uganda, the international community is extremely stretched. On the one hand, it might want to engage in Uganda, but what about the elections in Tanzania that were just held? What about Cote d'Ivoire? What about Guinea, which is in a very similar kind of situation? What about Ethiopia, where we may be looking at a civil war that would have major regional implications? I think the international community at the minute might actually lack the kind of bandwidth and power and capacity to actually engage in all of these different areas at the same time. I mean, we forget, because we've moved on, because 2020 has been such a crazy year, that we still have conflict, basically kind of being frozen but not in any way resolved in South Sudan. So I think when you add all of that together, it starts to become clear that even though we would all like the international community to be more effective in these spaces, that they are not going to be the kind of shining knights that come in and save the day. And I would be very surprised if we see really effective international activity around Uganda. And I'd be really surprised if we see really effective international activity around Zambia. I think what international powers are starting to do is try and use their leverage behind the scenes, talking to governments and presidents, perhaps making some veiled threats, but behind the scenes to try and force governments to arrest fewer people, to commit fewer human rights violations. But what they're doing less of is kind of coordinating publicly into broad coalitions and using their collective weight. And I suppose my concern is that in countries like Uganda and Ethiopia, you really need a united international community to actually have, a real effect. Now, Joe Biden could provide some of that leadership as president of the United States, but my worry there would be that he's going to be so consumed with, rebuilding America and healing the scars of America and dealing with COVID in America, that he's not going to be able to have a lot of time for, a really engaged Africa policy, at least for the first couple of years of his presidency. So I think it's really a serious moment. I think we have a number of different factors, COVID-19, the international community being disengaged right now. I think these are the factors that are emboldening leaders like Museveni and Magufuli. And I think there really is a risk that by the time the international community re-engages in a year or two's time, we'll have seen significant democratic losses across Africa that will take many years to fight back and rebuild.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I know you say you have a bit of a time constraint.
It's been a real pleasure. Good luck, everyone. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you. Thank you very much for doing me the honor of inviting me on the show. Yeah, I have to run now. That the connection is also really bad. But I hope that we might be able to speak as we get closer to the election and we can see how some of the things we've talked about today are unfolding.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nick.
My pleasure. Take care. Thanks for the honor of inviting me.
Yeah, so we see that all of our guests are really troubled by their connections.
Yes.
So maybe it is interesting to review a little bit what crazy week we have seen. I mean, first of all, the campaign that Nup was doing in the east and the north, and you already described when they went through the swamp to evade the military. But it was also the pictures, right? These fantastic pictures that were taken. And then I don't know which place it was where Bobi Wine had to run, and they started to run, right? Mm-hmm. And that also created a fantastic picture.
Yes.
And then there was this other opportunity when it started to rain, and he opened his arms like this, and he was totally wet, and it was almost like a Messiah picture. And I really think with all these pictures, well, first of all, it also showed in the survey that he is just winning a lot of votes in those regions and actually all across Uganda. But he might also just get a world press photo with this, because it's just giving a lot of very good publicity for Nup. Then, unfortunately, we had the arrest and then the extreme violence.
Yes.
Right.
And then, of course, there was also the arrest of POA from Amriat, from FDC, around the same time.
Exactly.
Bobi Wine was arrested. Maria, what do you think about the unity that opposition leaders showed around the time Amriat and Bobi Wine were arrested?
I think this has been part of the culture of politics, I would say, in Uganda. You know, when you look at the opposition, you know, like always, some opposition leaders have been standing in unity, actually, when there is oppression. And I think this is the way to do. I think what actually democracy defines is that diversity in unity. Yes. So we have different ideologies, but we have the same goal, you know, that we're looking at. And the same goal is that to have change. So I think that was really a good sign, and you know, a focus or a broadcast for what we need in the future, you know, so that what unites us is us being Ugandans, despite of our political affiliations. Okay. So elections are going to be there, but we're going to be Ugandans. So what makes a good Uganda is understanding our diversity, and in that uniqueness, you know, and of course, as a country, we have a lot to learn, you know, how we've coexisted, you know, together, and that actually brings up, you know, what the opposition did in support.
Yes, and then I want to talk about the meeting today with Lina Zedriga, Honorable Norbert Mao, General Mugisha Muntu, and Henry Tumukunde, and then there's also Waswa Bigura, if I'm saying his name right. But they say that in their meeting to form some kind of a coalition for unity, they have not decided that they want to front one candidate. all the presidential candidates wants to go forward and run for presidency. However, they said we've resolved the issues they resolved were as follows. We are in this together as leaders who are responding to a failing state. We shall avoid attacking each other and thus deny the regime the opportunity to divide us, up in the field. We agree on a common understanding of each other's positions in order to avoid contradictions that may play into the hands of the regime. We pledge to work together in areas of common interests. Where we do not agree, we shall strive to understand each other. If one of us is arrested, harassed, or mishandled, we shall all stand together in solidarity. We've agreed to design a common response to the arrests, brutalization, and harassment of candidates aimed at denying them access to the electorate. We are on different fronts, but our cause is the same: change. What is your response to that, Maria?
No, I think personally this is a commitment, and I think it came at the right time, because before Uganda, like we've been having all these issues, like the opposition coming together, and then all of a sudden, so they start, breaking up. But I think this is a commitment, and this commitment that they've done, because many Ugandans are looking at politicians as as the examples, so whatever a political leader says, most people are following them, especially political candidates, presidential candidates. There are very many millions of Ugandans that are following them. So whatever they do say, it has a big impact. And I think, to me, this shows now that, we're starting on the process of peace building. Personally, I believe this, because this is starting with us, and it's starting with the political heads that we're looking up to. So if we call upon unity at this time and making this declaration, I have much hope that even the followers, we shall be united. And if there is something that there is, there is a platform that, is going to bring us out of this. So I'm so certain that all Ugandans are willing, to support each other and not to be divided, because taking off the dictatorship is a national issue, and I think most people are really affected. So this unity is something that we've been yearning for, and it has come at the right time.
Absolutely, and it's really sad that it actually took this. We all knew this was coming. This was going to come at some point, and I was very certain. Been preaching unity from the very start. I was very certain that opposition would be forced to unite, whether they wanted to unite or not. But it's really sad that it took Bobi Wine's arrest and Amriat's arrest for them to basically come to terms to the fact that they do have to meet and they have to talk about a way forward that stands for, a common goal and a collective vision as we head into a new Uganda. Go on ahead, Nico.
Yeah, I totally agree what you're saying on that we have to join forces, and that is our strength. And the second thing is online is our strength. Yes. Maybe we can be beaten in the streets, but we can't be beaten online. That was very clear earlier this week when everybody saw all the violence in the street and Bobi Wine was arrested. And obviously, Free Bobi Wine became a trending hashtag. And still, there were these government supporters that started to trend with hooliganism. That just doesn't make sense, right? So then you're just living in a world of alternative facts. So obviously, 2 weeks ago, we explained that we would be documenting all the incidents that took place. But last Wednesday, it was just crazy. We had, there were so many incidents. I think we created a couple of posts about it, but it was just too much for us to all do. But still, we will continue, and we will make that database of all the violations that take place.
Yeah.
Now, the thing that I pulled up is our Twitter page. Twitter is one of the areas that online is important. Now, although most Ugandans are on Facebook, still it is important that they should also come to Twitter, because many influential people in the West are also on Twitter. So if we want to pressure the West to stop funding the dictatorship in Uganda, then it really helps if people are coming to Twitter. And in 2 weeks, we're actually going to have a special event about activism and social media, because there is so much for us to learn on social media. And what are the right hashtags?
Yes.
Who do you approach? How do you do it? How is it possible to really make change on social media? So so that will be very, very interesting, I think.
Absolutely. And then on behalf of People Power, there is some events that are taking place. I believe today, as we speak, there might be a campaign, Free Bobby Wine protest taking place in Boston, Massachusetts. And you ask, Bobby Wine is already out. Why is there a free Bobby Wine campaign, protest taking place? And the reason why is because he's not yet free until there's no constraints on his bail, and at the moment.
And he is not free to go where he wants.
Yes.
He is not free to say what he wants.
Yes.
Right? So you're totally right. He is not free. And this hashtag is very much covering what is going on, because it's about free Bobby Wine and it's about freeing Ugandans.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Right.
So we definitely need to continue using that hashtag. And then, of course, on the 30th of December, on the 30th of November, Washington, D.C., which is my city, inclusive of Washington, D.C., Maryland, and Virginia, and all our friends, brothers and sisters here in the United States. And again, regardless of which political party you belong to, religious background, please come join us. When we support Bobby Wine, we are supporting Uganda. When we support Amriat, we are supporting Uganda. And as we saw earlier on this week, it was really nice to see General Mugisha Muntu basically put a stop on his campaign, saying that until Bobby Wine is free and is allowed to campaign, they will halt their campaigns as well. And then, of course, we saw Amriat come out and I think do the same exact thing. And General Tumukunde from the Renewed Uganda, they also came out and basically joined hands with Uganda, with People Power and NUP, and did the same thing. So there is a chance to unity up ahead. So let's continue using the Free Bobby Wine hashtag. And then what other hashtags do you recommend Ugandans to use right now at the moment, Nico?
Well, I think first of all, the hashtag that Bobby Wine is promoting himself, which is "We are removing a dictator."
Yes.
I think you can use that hashtag whether you are in NUP, in FDC, or any other party. Then I think a very short and powerful one is Stop M7. That works. And then the daily thing that Ugandans are suffering from is police brutality. So the powerful hashtag there is Stop Police Brutality in Uganda. And then without spaces altogether. Those are important hashtags. And then if you want to address, for example, the European Union, then you could use EU blood money, because that's what happens with money that is coming from the European Union. Now, you were giving that announcement of the Boston demonstration, and that is really great. Shall we, for some inspiration, look at the demonstration from Amsterdam?
What was that again?
Shall I show the demonstration from The Hague?
Of course, go right ahead.
Free Bobi Wine! Free Bobi Wine! Museveni must go! Museveni must go!
We are here to demonstrate against the brutality of the police of Uganda.
We are the Parliament in Den Haag, and we are here to demonstrate for the freedom of our president, Bobi Wine, aka Robert Kyagulanyi Ssentamu, who was kidnapped violently and brutalized and is in custody, in police custody in Nalufenya. That place is known as a torture center for every Ugandan who goes there. Museveni, he has been president of Uganda for over 35 years and is still ruling us forcefully. The economy is too bad. People are going to school, but there are no jobs for them. The health sector is too bad. The education sector is too bad. The economy is too bad. But it's still him and his small team are still insisting of ruling the country.
This is my message to Museveni. After 35 years, your slogan for this campaign, you are saying you're securing our future. It's been 35 years. Which future have you secured for us? We completed school, but we couldn't even go any further. No jobs, no medicine in the hospital. Which promises are you making now that you couldn't fulfill in the past 35 years?
Himself said he's not working for Ugandans. He's working for himself and his family and his grandchildren. You know, so we need a person who cares about the Ugandans.
Yesterday was one of the saddest days of my life. They were using guns. They were beating people. And these are people who had nothing. They couldn't afford them. I saw my brothers. I saw my sisters going down on the streets, crying.
Black lives still matter, also in Uganda.
Enough is enough. And I have an appeal to the Dutch government also. Thank you so much for letting us express. But stop also funding the regime. Over 20 million euros have been spent in the 10 years in the Ugandan government. We have this report and we intend to file it in a petition formally. We ask you, stop funding the government and at least come up and condemn the practices that are going on in our country.
Please stop the support you're giving to Uganda. Not until the only support we need right now is you to help us to bring Museveni down.
Stop the funding. Stop funding Museveni.
Very powerful.
Yeah, that was very nice done by Timo de Driesen. Thanks for that. Yes. So do we have anything to say to our viewers before we go, Patricia?
Continue to support the idea and the notion of unity. We are going to need everyone on board to get rid of dictator Museveni, but it is very important to note that, yes, the people of Uganda have already united against dictatorship. And what we are waiting for right now is the leaders to unite. But again, we must understand that freeing Uganda is not dependent on just the leaders themselves. It's really mainly dependent on the people of Uganda because the people of Uganda outnumber the few presidential candidates on the ballot paper. And so let us, again, continue pushing the notion for unity. And then it's important to also think about, in leadership and in organization, there's a bottom, up organization, and then there's also top-down organization. And so with what we are looking at right now, it's going to be, we need to use that bottom-up organization to force the leaders to unite. And what that means is that you, the citizen of Uganda, that believes in unity, that wants to get rid of dictator Museveni, you preach that message of unity all the way up to your leader, whoever your leader might be, and you're basically telling your leaders to unite. So when all the people, when the majority of our Noob supporters are telling Bobi Wine that we want unity, which is something that we did very early on when we were people power, he pushed that message of unity. and it worked. And so those that are supporting Mugisha Muntu, Amria, do the same thing. Tell your leaders you want unity. And of course, they're already on board in a lot of different ways. We just need to continue pushing forward. But that is my message, and please visit www.freedomuganda.com. The page is is in a work in progress. However, we are putting as much information on there for you to make activism a bit more easier for you, and a resource link that we'll be putting up very soon. And Nico, over to you. And I think that's it from me.
No, those were fantastic words, Patricia. I want to thank our viewers, and we'll see them in 2 weeks on the 4th of December.
Thank you, guys. Really appreciate it.
Okay, bye-bye.